Good evening, dear listener. Tonight, as the world outside quiets and the hum of the day softens into a gentle hush, I invite you to settle in. Let your blanket wrap around your shoulders like a woolen cloak. Let your breath slow like the tolling of a distant bell. This evening, we drift far back into a time of torchlight and silence, of parchment and prayer, of mystery and medicine, a time when the world was steeped in symbols and shadows, when the night sky was alive with signs, and when the human mind just, like now, yearned to wander beyond the boundaries of the ordinary. Tonight, we begin a story about the hidden corners of medieval life. Not of kings or knights, but of something quieter, something stranger, something deeply human. The longing to feel something else. To see the world not as it is, but as it could be, to slip beyond the veil of consciousness, to escape pain, to reach for the divine, to surrender to visions. Tonight, dear friend, we explore what getting high was really like in medieval times. It may seem strange to imagine monks, peasants, or even physicians in the Middle Ages seeking altered states of consciousness, but the truth is as old as humanity itself. For as long as we have walked on 2 feet and gathered around fires, we have searched for ways to shift our minds to dream with our eyes open, to hear whispers from the beyond, to soothe the aches that live in the body and in the soul. The medieval world, wrapped in incense and stained glass, was no different, and if anything, it was a world that needed dreams more than most. A world marked by hunger, plague, war, and rigid control, but also by mystery, wonder, and faith. Imagine that. To live in a world where a thunderstorm might be a message from God, where illness was not a matter of germs, but of spirits or imbalance. In such a world, to seek a different state of mind was not only natural, it was necessary. In medieval Europe, altered states weren't always sought through substances alone. Yes, there were herbs and potions and brews we speak of those sun, but there were also fasting rituals, so long and severe that hallucinations began to flicker at the edge of vision. There were prayers spoken for hours, until words lost meaning and the speaker was transported beyond themselves. There were ecstatic dances, long nights without sleep, pilgrimages on bleeding feet. The medieval path to transcendence was winding and often wild. Sometimes it was holy, sometimes heretical, sometimes both. Let us begin in the quiet stone apothecaries of the medieval cities. Behind wooden counters lined with dusty vials and strange-smelling roots, early pharmacists, often monks, or wise women, prepared herbal mixtures for every ailment of the body and soul. One of the most commonly used plants was mandrake, with its gnarled root, often resembling a human form. Mandrake was surrounded by legend, said Scree when pulled from the earth. It was used in potions that eased pain and brought deep, dream-filled sleep. Taken in small amounts, it dulled the senses, calmed the nerves. In larger amounts, it could bring on visions, sometimes peaceful, sometimes terrifying. Those who used it carefully were said to enter a state of divine sleep, where the soul wandered freely, while the body lay still. Then there was henbane, a pale and unassuming plant with a powerful spirit. Used cautiously, it could ease toothaches or lull a patient before surgery. Used without knowledge, it could send the user spiraling into a night of feverish dreams and voices from nowhere. In many villages, it was said to open the door between the worlds. Those who took it reported feeling as though they had left their body. They floated above the rafters. They spoke with saints or demons. They wandered through strange landscapes that felt both familiar and utterly alien. For some, it was healing. For others, it was frightening. But it was always powerful. And opium, yes, even then found its way into the physician's kit, known to Arab medical scholars and passed westward through trade and conquest. Opium was used in tinctures, powders, and pastes. It soothed pain like no other. A night wound in battle might be given a small, bitter dose to still his cries. A woman in childbirth might sip a preparation mixed with honey, and afterward their dreams would be long and deep, filled with strange symbols. Many saw angels. Others saw the faces of their lost. A few never woke at all. But getting high in the medieval world wasn't always about herbs or opiates. Sometimes it was the body's own chemistry, stirred by devotion or deprivation. Monks fasted for days, drinking only weak beer or broth, praying through the hours until their minds began to detach from their They reported feeling light, lifted, filled with grace. They heard music in the silence. They saw lights in the dark. In their journals, if they were brave enough to write about it, they spoke of union with the divine, of being taken up into God's presence. Today, we might call these altered states. Back then, there were glimpses of heaven. Pilgrims, too, trudging across Europe with blistered feet and hope in their hearts, often entered a kind of trance. The endless walking, the chanting, the rhythm of prayer and breath and pain, it created something like a meditative fugue. By the time they reached the holy site, many were weeping, trembling, some even fainting, not from illness, but from something else. Something ... beyond. Let us not forget the witches, or at least those women and men accused of witchcraft, orphan healers, midwives, or herbalists. They knew the plants that could alter the mind, and they passed those secrets in whispers. Belladonna, also known as deadly nightshade, was one such plant. Its berries, dark and glossy, could bring on visions of flight. Taken in just the right way, it caused the sensation of soaring through the air. Some scholars now believe that the witch's broomstick, a symbol so often mocked, was a tool for applying these substances to the skin. In private rituals, often held in forests or hidden groves, these practitioners sought not evil, but understanding, connection, power. In the Muslim world, which at times stretched into medieval Spain and Sicily, scholars and mystics also explored altered states. The Sufis, Islamic mystics, practiced ecstatic dance and chanting that led to deep spiritual trances. They spun and recited the names of God until the self dissolved, until only presence remained. They drank no wine, but their hearts were drunk on divinity. Christian mystics, too, described similar experiences, visions of Christ, of Mary, of angels, and their language was rich with longing and beauty. For them, ecstasy was not a sin, but a sacrament. And yes, there was alcohol, wine, ale, mead, all common, all consumed regularly. But even these simple drinks could become vehicles for altered perception. In monasteries, wine was a gift from God, measured, sacred, calming. In taverns, it was a way to forget hardship. A peasant, after a hard day in the fields, might drink until the world softened at the edges, until laughter came more easily, until grief lost its grip. And in that moment, wasn't he also seeking something beyond the everyday? This is the heart of the story. Medieval people, though shaped by religion and fear and 1,000 rules, were still people. They dreamed, they heard, they reached, and sometimes they needed to step away from the harshness of reality and into a gentler place, even if only for a moment. They turned to plants, to prayer, to ritual, to rhythm. They sought peace, or insight, or simply a different feeling. So tonight, as your eyes grow heavy and your breath grows deep, let yourself feel that ancient longing. The longing not just to know, but to feel differently. To rest your burdens and drift whether through herbs, or hope, or holy dreams. You do not need mandrake or wine to float tonight. Only breath, only stillness. Let the hum of medieval chants echo in your mind. Let the smoke of incense drift across your thoughts. Let the herbs of the apothecary crumble between your fingers. The journey into the altered realms has only just begun. We walk not in search of kings or saints, but of something older and perhaps even more powerful plants. Herbs, roots, and flowers, the humble gifts of the earth that, in the medieval world, held secrets both healing and haunting. So close your eyes, if you wish, and breathe in deeply. Let the scent of wild thyme and crushed sage dance on the air. Tonight, we'll explore the curious, quiet world of medieval herbalism and the mind-altering plants that lived at the heart of medicine, mystery, and magic. In the medieval world, herbs were everything. They were medicine, food, incense, magic, and myth. Long before pharmacies and hospitals, people turned to their gardens and to the wild woods for healing and comfort. And while many plants were used to soothe sore throats or spice a stew, others had more peculiar effects. They calmed the nerves, dulled pain, brought on vivid dreams, or if handled unwisely unleashed wild visions. To understand how medieval people got high, we must first understand how they lived with plants. They lived closely, reverently, cautiously. Imagine a monastery garden, enclosed by stone walls and tended by monks in long brown robes. The air is cool, the sunlight dappled, and all around, rows of green shimmer softly in the breeze. These were no ordinary gardens. They were sacred spaces, designed not for beauty but for healing. Lavender to soothe grief, yarrow to staunch wounds, chamomile to ease digestion, and nestled among them, sometimes hidden, sometimes honored plants of a different nature. Plants that reached beyond the body and into the mind. One such plant was henbane, known in Latin as hyoscyamus. Its pale, yellow flowers, veined with purple, looked almost otherworldly, and indeed, its effects were just that. Henbane was used by healers to ease pain and induce sleep. But take too much, and the world turned strange. Walls shimmered, voices whispered from the corners of rooms, and faces became unfamiliar. It was said to open the gates of madness or of prophecy. Witches were rumored to use it in flying ointments, concoctions that allowed their spirits to leave their bodies and dance in the night sky. But in truth, even monks used it, with careful dosage, in salves for toothaches and poultices for aching bones. The line between medicine and magic was thinner than a blade of grass. Then there was belladonna, beautiful lady, Atropa belladonna, with its glossy black berries and dark history. In Italy, noble women once used drops of belladonna juice to dilate their pupils, believing it made them more alluring. But in medieval medicine, the plant was used with reverent fear. A few drops could numb pain. A few more could lull a patient into unconsciousness before surgery, but cross the line, and the dreams turned feverish, the heart raced, and death crept in silently. Still, some healers claimed that belladonna opened the mind to spiritual truths, that it brought visions of saints, or memories from past lives. A dangerous door, but a door nonetheless. Mandrake deserves its own quiet pause. This plant, with roots shaped like tiny humans, was the stuff of legend. It was said that to pull a mandrake from the earth without proper ritual would cause it to scream a scream so dreadful it could kill. Whether this was believed literally or as metaphor, we may never know, but what is certain is this. The mandrake was powerful. It was used in sleeping potions, love, charms, and fertility rituals. It was associated with creation and destruction. Carried in the pocket, it was said to bring luck. Brewed in wine, it could bring dreams of great beauty or deep madness. Its power was known across Europe, from cloistered monks to village witches. Yet not all mind-altering herbs were cloaked in fear. Some, like sage, mugwort, and valerian, were part of daily life, their effects subtle but profound. Mugwort in particular was known as the dream herb. Women placed it under their pillows to encourage prophetic dreams. Travelers tucked it in their shoes to ease fatigue and stir visions on the road. Imagine it, if you like, as something far older a brew that once filled the cups of peasants and princes alike. Tonight, our journey leads us to the taverns, the cloisters, the banquet halls, and the brewery cellars of the medieval world, where one intoxicant reigned above all others, not rare herbs or foreign powders, but something so commonplace it sat at every table. Tonight, we explore the warm, foamy world of alcohol. In medieval Europe, alcohol wasn't just a luxury. It was daily life, a necessity, a comfort, a custom. It crossed social classes and seasons. It warmed cold bones in winter and quenched thirst in summer. But more than that, it shaped gatherings, sealed agreements, and offered a gentle nudge toward laughter, music, and maybe even mischief. Let's begin, perhaps, with the most basic and beloved of them all. Not quite the beer we know today, but a close, earthy ancestor. In early medieval villages, nearly every household brewed its own version, a cloudy, yeasty drink, often unfiltered, mildly bitter, and low in alcohol. But don't let its simplicity fool you. This was more than a beverage. It was sustenance. You see, water, especially in towns, wasn't always safe to drink. It could be tainted by runoff, sewage, or standing stagnant in troughs. Ale, lightly fermented and boiled during brewing, was safer. For children, the elderly, the labourer, and the noble it was nourishment. Something to sip with bread and stew. Something to carry in clay jugs to the field at dawn. Morning ale was a real thing, mild, comforting, and part of the rhythm of life. And yes, it could get stronger. In monasteries and alehouses, brewers began to experiment. They added hops, which extended shelf life and introduced that sharp, familiar bitterness. They varied grains, barley oats, rye, changing the brew's weight and character. Some ales were hearty enough to warm the chest, others light and bright enough for long afternoons under the sun. But each one offered a kind of soft intoxication, a haze that slowed the edges of thought, a looseness of limbs, a smile that came easier. Monks, you might be surprised to hear, were some of the most sophisticated brewers of all. Within the quiet cloisters of Benedictine and Cistercian monasteries, great care was taken to perfect the art of fermentation. Brew logs, recipes, and seasonal notes were carefully recorded by hand. In these sacred spaces, beer was not just a drink, it was a divine gift, something to be made with patience and prayer. Monks drank ale with their meals, sometimes several times a day, particularly during fasting seasons, when solid food was scarce. Liquid bread, they called it, a way to nourish the body while honoring the soul. Now let us step into a different world, the world of mead. Golden and glistening like captured sunlight, mead was made by fermenting honey with water, sometimes infused with herbs or fruits. Mead carried with it the whisper of the wild, of bees and blossoms, of forests and feasts. It was less common than ale, for honey was precious. But when it appeared at weddings, festivals, or sacred rites, it brought with it a sense of reverence, a little sweetness, a little magic. Drinking mead wasn't always about thirst. It was about tradition. In Norse and early Celtic cultures, mead was linked to poetry, to prophecy, to passion. The very word honeymoon comes from the tradition of newlyweds drinking mead for a full moon cycle, believing it brought fertility and harmony. Imagine that, a month of toasts beneath the stars, the soft hum of bees woven into each golden sip. As the medieval world matured and trade routes widened, another intoxicant grew in power and prestige: wine. Grapevines crept across hillsides from Italy to France to Germany, basking in sunlight, soaking up where ale was earthy, wine was refined. Associated with the church, nobility, and foreign lands, the Mass itself revolved around wine, transubstantiated, sanctified, and sacred. Wine came in many forms: deep reds, pale whites, spiced versions called hippocras, and fortified sweet wines imported from the Mediterranean. It was drunk warm or cool, mulled with cinnamon and cloves, or diluted with water. Among the aristocracy, it flowed freely during banquets, but even peasants, on occasion, might receive a small cup, especially at festivals or funerals. And wine, like ale, offered more than mere inebriation. It created atmosphere. It loosened the tongue. It made music sweeter and jokes funnier. A gathering might begin stiff and formal, but with each cup passed, barriers dissolved, friendships blossomed, secrets spilled. A tired mind could drift gently into reverie. Taverns, those cozy, candlelit dens of warmth and chatter, were central to medieval social life. Every town had one, or several. Some doubled as inns, others as meeting halls or places of unofficial justice. They echoed with laughter, arguments, singing, and the clink of mugs. Picture it: rough wooden benches, dogs curled underfoot, the smell of roasted onions and damp cloaks, and in every hand a cup. Maybe clay, maybe pewter, but always full. There were games, dice, cards, even early versions of chess, storytelling, a bit of flirtation, perhaps, and always the steady beat of conversation, smoothed by alcohol's soft touch. These were places where news travelled, where gossip brewed, where alliances formed and sometimes, where regrets were born the next morning. But alcohol wasn't confined to towns and monasteries. Even in remote villages and farmsteads, brewing was a home craft. Recipes were passed from mother to daughter, neighbor to neighbor. Brewing days were communal kettles stirred over open fires, steam rising into thatched roofs, the smell of malt drifting down muddy lanes. Children, too, drank diluted ale. It was called small beer, and had just enough fermentation to kill bacteria, but not enough to cause drunkenness. It was served at breakfast, lunch, and supper. To medieval minds, this wasn't strange, it was practical. Even milk could spoil quickly. Ale endured, but of course there were dangers. Strong drink could lead to quarrels, to accidents, to sins of the tongue or body. The Church, ever watchful, warned against drunkenness. Moderation was praised, excess condemned. Drunkenness, it was taught, opened the soul to temptation, to demons. Even a man who drank too much might find his dreams haunted or his judgment clouded. And yet most clergy, especially monks, drank daily. It was not the drink, but the intent, they said. Drink with thanks, not greed. Across Europe, customs evolved. In the British Isles, ale remained king. In France, wine flowed in the courts. In the colder parts of Germany and Scandinavia, mead and beer kept hearths warm. In every region, alcohol was woven into the seasons. The harvest brought fresh brews. Winter solstice called for spiced wines. Spring meant lighter ales. And summer, well, there was no season without a reason for a drink. Even during death, alcohol played a role. At funerals, mourners raised a final cup to the departed, a drink to remember, to grieve, and perhaps to forget for a little while. In many villages, a wake was as much about storytelling and sipping as about sorrow. The line between the sacred and the social was always porous, and behind it all, a quiet truth lingered. Alcohol offered more than intoxication. It was connection, a shared experience, a comfort in hard times, a small indulgence in a world often filled with struggle. When the day's work was done, when the bread was baked and the animals fed, there was always time for a cup, a pause, a breath, a smile. So tonight, as you settle deeper beneath your blanket, imagine the gentle clink of mugs, the soft flicker of a hearth, a world slower, rougher, yes, but also rich with custom, community, and care. In that world, a drink wasn't just a drink. It was a moment, a ritual, a way to feel, if only for a while, a little lighter. Let the hush of the medieval world surround you, and listen gently as we begin. In the medieval mind, pain was both a physical and spiritual trial. It was believed that suffering had divine purpose, sometimes a punishment, sometimes a test, and sometimes a path to understanding. Yet even in this deeply religious landscape, no one liked pain. And across monasteries, marketplaces, and manor houses, people turned to plants and substances, quiet gifts from nature and trade for comfort, control, and sometimes transcendence. Among the most powerful of these gifts was the opium poppy. The poppy wasn't native to Europe, but by the Middle Ages it had found its way west through ancient Greek, Roman, and Islamic medical texts, known for centuries for its powerful effects. Tar-like sap collected from poppy seed pods was prized for its ability to dull pain, calm the mind, and induce sleep. It was a medicine, but in strong doses it could send one spiraling into dreams that felt more like visions or let the soul drift too far from the body entirely. Let us step now into a dimly lit apothecary in 13th century Italy. Wooden shelves lined the walls, filled with dried herbs, oils, and curious powders. The air is thick with the scent of sage, lavender, and something more bitter poppy resin, wrapped in cloth and tucked beside the mortar and pestle. A bearded physician leans over his patient, grinding a paste. The patient groans softly, clutching his belly. An ulcer, perhaps, or the aftermath of some spoiled meat, the doctor murmurs softly, not to the patient, but as a prayer to Galen Hippocrates, or perhaps the Virgin herself. He mixes powdered opium sometimes, called tinctura thebaca, with honey or wine, not too much. Just enough to ease the body, calm the mind. The line between cure and curse is delicate, after all. Opium was widely used, but it wasn't always clearly named. Medieval physicians often cloaked it in coded language. gyakojun, teriyaki. These were mixtures, often combining opium with other ingredients like cinnamon, cardamom, saffron, or myrrh. Recipes varied wildly from one healer to another, depending on the herbs they had, the teachings they followed, and the effects they wished to create. One of the most famous preparations was theriac, a thick, complex paste originally designed as an antidote for poison, but eventually used for nearly every ailment imaginable. The Roman physician Galen, whose texts heavily influenced medieval medicine, praised theriac as a near-universal remedy. Over time, its formula grew to include up to 64 ingredients. Opium was one of the key components, and its presence was no accident. Imagine now a noble woman suffering from toothache or the phantom pains of grief. A physician is summoned, and he opens a small brass box, scooping out a bit of theriac to place under her tongue. Within minutes, the pain eases, her limbs relax, her sorrow seems lighter. Sleep will come easily tonight, but opium wasn't reserved for the rich. In village huts and shepherds' lean-tos, wise women and midwives used poppy syrup, sometimes mixed with milk, to soothe colicky babies. Though dangerous by modern standards, these concoctions were seen as kind gifts. Mothers didn't understand the pharmacology, but they trusted the calm that followed. Let us pause now and travel further eastward in our imagination to the medical schools of Salerno in southern Italy. Here, Arabic and Greco-Roman knowledge met in translated manuscripts, carefully copied by candlelight. It was in places like this that medieval doctors learned about the soporific sponger cloth, soaked in a mix of opium, mandrake, henbane, and hemlock. When pressed to a patient's face, it induced a sleep deep enough for primitive surgery. Such practices were risky. The dose had to be just right. Too little, and the pain returned with screams. Too much, and the soul might not return at all. Yet when done well, it was a miracle. Teeth could be pulled, arrows could be removed, tumors lanced. In the language of the time, it was not anesthesia, it was mercy. In monasteries, where monks were both healers and theologians, opium's use was more complicated. The body, they believed, was a vessel for the soul. To cloud the senses was to risk sin. Yet even the most devout understood that suffering, especially at the end of life, needed easing. Many hospice monks quietly administered opium in final days, not to numb the soul, but to prepare it for God's embrace. Let us now walk into one of these infirmaries. The stone walls are cool, the windows narrow. Beeswax candles flicker near the crucifix. A dying man breathes in rattled sighs. A monk crushes dried poppy petals into wine and lifts the cup to the man's lips. The monk says nothing. Only a prayer moves on his breath. Opium wasn't tea, the only substance used to alter the mind and body in the name of healing. The medieval world was filled with natural narcotics and sedatives, from the mandrake root, twisted like a human form, to the dusky henbane with its yellow flowers and hallucinogenic effects. Healers had many tools, each both cure and risk. The mandrake, especially, occupied a strange place in medieval imagination. It was said to scream when uprooted, killing anyone who heard it. Yet when prepared properly, it was a powerful anesthetic. Physicians would boil pieces of the root in wine, creating a bitter, sleep-inducing tonic. Many believed it opened a doorway not just to unconsciousness, but to visions and divine dreams. Henbane and belladonna were also used. Both could cause hallucinations, especially in large doses. While technically not narcotics in the modern sense, They altered perception so vividly that many associated them with witchcraft or demonic possession. But in the right hands, at the right moment, they were part of the healing craft. These substances blurred lines, not only between medicine and mysticism, but also between body and soul. A patient eased by opium might wake with strange dreams, or speak in riddles. Was it the medicine, or a message from beyond? Medieval people were not quick to separate the physical from the spiritual. A night of opium-induced visions might be remembered as a revelation. Merchants also played a key role in bringing these substances westward. Opium came overland via the Silk Road, tucked into bundles of spice and incense, and by sea through Venetian traders. Apothecaries in large cities, Paris, London, Florence, paid high prices for these rare imports. In their shops, one might find cinnamon, pepper, myrrh, and a small black lump wrapped in cloth, stored with reverence. As night deepens, let your imagination drift now into one of these shops. Shelves lined with brass jars, a hanging scale for precise measurement, the soft clink of weights and glass, a merchant with ink-stained fingers, carefully blending powders while whispering advice, only a pinch, with wine, and never on feast days. Despite its widespread use, opium was not without danger. Medieval texts warned of its power. Take too much, and the patient may fall into a sleep from which they never wake. And yet, many physicians defended it. A small risk, they argued, compared to the agony of childbirth, the torment of stone wounds, or the long death of fever. And yes, opium was used during childbirth. Though the church cautioned against dulling, a woman's labourer's pain was seen as part of Eve's cursum. Midwives quietly administered poppy syrup. They did so not out of rebellion, but compassion. Every scream softened, every hour shortened, felt like a small miracle. We must also mention the blurred boundary between medicine and pleasure. A patient might be given opium to ease pain, but also experience euphoria, warmth, and a floating lightness. Some may have sought it not for healing, but for escape. Medieval records are cautious, but occasional references suggest that opium's effects were known, and sometimes misused. A monk might speak of a brother who had fallen too often into sleep. A merchant might sell poppy extract under the table. No questions asked, but these were exceptions, not the rule. For most, narcotics were sacred tools, dangerous, yes, but necessary. They brought silence to suffering. They offered peace where there was none. And now, as you rest quietly, let yourself imagine that sleep that came with one small sip from the apothecary's cup, the edges of pain softening, the thoughts slowing, then floating, the body no longer trapped by its aches. The gentle surrender was not always feared. Sometimes it was welcomed. Sometimes it was the closest thing to peace. So tonight, as you let go, know that even in the darkest times, people sought comfort through herbs, prayers, tinctures, and quiet rituals. They tried to soothe the hurts that could not be seen. They did their best with what they had, and in doing so, they left behind stories, soft ones, strange ones about how the body heals. Tonight, let us slip a little deeper into the strange, soft underworld of medieval medicine and mysticism. A world not ruled only by poppies and prayer, but one darkly coloured by the most powerful plants of all. Mandrake, henbane, nightshade, names that whisper like incantations, names that lived in both herb lore and fear, tucked inside leather-bound tomes and the hushed memories of midwives, monks, and those who practiced healing in the quiet corners of history. These were not everyday herbs. One grew beside leeks and onions. These were plants touched by myth, by mystery, and some said by magic itself. Let your mind drift for a moment to the soft dirt of a medieval garden, perhaps, at the back of an apothecary's shop. The air is thick with lavender and rosemary, but just beyond, in a shadowed patch, 3 strange plants grow. Their shapes are unnatural, their leaves are thick, their berries glossy, almost too red. You're told not to touch them, but their names are spoken anyway, with both reverence and fear. Mandrake, known across Europe, and older still in legend, its roots, it was said, grew in the shape of a tiny persona, man or woman, pulled from the earth itself, and when you pulled it, if you dared, it screamed. Yes, they believed it screamed. This wasn't just folklore whispered by peasants. Physicians and scholars from antiquity passed this tale through the centuries. Pliny the Elder wrote of it. The Talmud mentioned it. Even in the medieval bestiaries and herbals, those illustrated manuals of the natural world do define drawings of a figure digging up mandrake, with a dog tied to the root, because it was said no human could hear that scream and live. Of course, it didn't really scream, but what it could do was almost as strange. The root, boiled or dried, was a powerful anesthetic. In the hands of monks or surgeons, it might be soaked in wine and offered to those needing surgery or suffering unbearable pain. In other circles more secret, more suspected, was believed to arouse visions, to open the mind to unseen realms, and yes, to stir desire. Isn't it strange? One root, shaped like a person, believed to cure barrenness, conjure spirits, and sedate pain. Perhaps that's why it nestled itself into both medicine and magic. In herbal texts, mandrake was categorized alongside sage and chamomile, but in folklore, it belonged to witches. And then there's a lesser-known name to us today, but once it was as infamous as any plant could be. It grew low to the ground with pale, veined flowers almost lovely in a sickly sort of way. Henbane had a smell some described as rank, almost meat-like, and its effects dizzying, dreamlike, and dangerous. It was said to blur the line between sleep and death, to induce hallucinations so vivid they felt like visions flying, floating, talking with spirits. Some thought it the secret ingredient in witches' flying ointment. Others used it in healing draughts, carefully measured to calm madness or relieve toothache. And yet the dosage was everything, too much. And the visions turned to terror. The heartbeat slowed, the body trembled, and the soul, some said, might not find its way back. Still, it was used, not by everyone, not openly, but enough to earn a place in both monastic medicine and the whispered rituals of the folk. Its duality fascinated people, both cure and curse. Henbane tea could settle a troubled spirit or summon one. And finally, nightshade belladonna, they sometimes called it beautiful lady. Though its berries are among the most toxic in Europe, they are round and black and gleam like obsidian in the sun. It is said that Roman women once used nightshade to dilate their pupils and make themselves more alluring. But in medieval times, its role shifted. It became a healer's secret, a poisonous tool, a sorcerer's charm. Let's walk further now, quietly, as if our steps pressed down the soft soil of a forest floor in early morning, a place where wild herbs bloom in the mist, and the air is thick with memory. You see, in the medieval mind, plants weren't just things to eat or brew. they were companions. Some helpful, some dangerous, some both. The use of mandrake, henbane, and nightshade was deeply rooted not only in medicine, but in meaning. Their presence in medieval homes, whether hidden in a pouch under the mattress or hanging in a dried bouquet over a kitchen hearth, signaled something deeper. A quiet rebellion, a whispered superstition, or sometimes hope. When the root came free, the dog would perish, but the human might survive. It sounds cruel, doesn't it? And yet, this myth, grim and wild, was retold in manuscripts, monastic texts, and even included in apothecary handbooks. Why? Perhaps not because they believed it fully, but because, in a world teetering between the sacred and the supernatural, one could never be too careful. Once harvested, the mandrake was not wasted. It could be shaved into powders, steeped in wine, or dried and carved into amulets. Some believed it brought fertility, others that it brought madness, but few denied its power. In villages where childbirth was perilous and medicine primitive, the mandrake root, with its human-like form, became a bridge between this world and whatever lay beyond it. Now let us look again at henbane, with its pale yellow petals veined in violet, its scent sharp and almost animal-like. Often dismissed as a weed, it crept along field edges and behind barn doors. And yet, this plant was among the most carefully guarded in a healer's collection. In moderate amounts, henbane soothed pain. Some early surgeons soaked cloth in henbane infusions to place over wounds. Monks in monastic infirmaries might add a touch to a sleeping draught, but too much and you did not simply fall asleep. You crossed over. Accounts from the time describe dreams, too vivid to bear visions of flying, of burning skies, of communion with the dead, a wandering of the soul that felt more like possession than rest. It's no wonder that henbane found its way into the legends of witches. A plant that could free the mind from the body. That sounded suspiciously like the devil's work. Yet not all who used henbane were accused of heresy. In fact, its presence in church-controlled infirmaries is well documented. The church, ever wary of pagan knowledge, also knew that pain was real and relief was rare. And so henbane, like many things in medieval life, straddled two worlds, useful and forbidden, sacred and feared. Then there's nightshade, so deceptive in beauty. You might walk by it and not even notice until the black berries caught your eye. Glossy, rich, and deadly. A child might think them fruit, but one taste could stop the heart. In folklore, nightshade was tied to the moon, to transformation, and to death. Some believed it allowed one to see spirits. Others swore it was the root of madness. And yet, it had its uses. Medieval midwives sometimes employed it just to drop to calm spasms during labor. Physicians, with great caution, administered it for tremors or to quiet seizures. It's a strange irony, isn't it, that the most dangerous plants were also the most precious, because they worked in an age with no antibiotics, no anesthesia, and no guarantees. These plants offered something else, a chance, a risk, a choice. Let's step into a medieval sick room now, dimly lit by a narrow window. A man lies sweating in fever. The physician, wearing robes that smell faintly of cloves and smoke, reaches for a cloth soaked in henbane. He places it gently on the man's brow. He recites a prayer, not unlike a spell. Outside, the village bell tolls the hour. The man may live, he may not. But in this moment, henbane holds the balance. Or imagine a young woman sitting beside a cold hearth, turning a mandrake root in her hand. She's been told she cannot conceive. The wise woman in the woods gave her this root and said, "Sleep with it beneath your bed for 3 nights. Do not speak of it." And so she does. What passes in her mind those nights? Hope, desperation, faith. In the morning, she buries the root in the earth, whispering her desire to the soil. Or perhaps picture a noble woman, eyes darkened with nightshade, her pupils wide, her lips colored faintly with berry juice. She appears bewitching. Her suitors fall silent in her presence. Her heart, perhaps, is guarded, but her image is unforgettable. This is the quiet magic of these plants. They didn't need cauldrons or thunderclaps. Their stories were passed from mother to daughter, from monk to novice, from patient to healer. They lived in the margins of medicine, of manuscripts, and of morality. It's worth noting, too, that these plants had enemies. The Church, particularly in the later Middle Ages, began to associate them more aggressively with heresy. As witch hunting became more widespread, possession of nightshade or henbane could be used as evidence. Even carrying a dried mandrake might draw suspicion. And yet, the plants persisted. They grew wild. After all, no man could burn every root. Let's return now to the garden we imagined earlier. The morning mist is clearing. A young healer kneels by her bed. She trims chamomile, checks her time, and then, carefully, she touches the leaves of her henbane plant, not to pick it, just to know it's there. She looks around. No one sees her, but still, she whispers a prayer of thanks and, perhaps, a warning, because she knows, as those before her knew, these plants are not evil. And in the hands of the wise, they heal. In the hands of the careless, they harm. And in stories, well, in stories, they live forever. You might think of cannabis as a modern story, one of modern debates, legalities, and headlines. But the truth stretches far deeper into the soil of history. The cannabis plant, humble and hardy, has been growing beside humanity for thousands of years, and by the time the medieval world unfurled its banners and built its cathedrals, cannabis had already taken root in more ways than one. In medieval Europe, it was not called by that name, of course. More often, it was hemp, a word with practical connotations, one tied to rope and cloth. But the plant was the same, tall and fibrous, crowned with green leaves shaped like open hands. In monastic gardens and farmers' fields alike, it swayed in the wind, its uses many and varied. Let's step now into one such field. Picture the soft roll of hills beneath a pale sky. A young monk walks slowly between rows of growing hemp. His hands are calloused from labor, his robes faded with time. He does not think of intoxication. He thinks of strength for rope, for sackcloth, for nets to catch fish. And yet, in another place, perhaps not too far away, the same plant is being boiled in oil and rubbed into aching joints, or steeped into tea for a sick child, or perhaps smoked by someone older, someone seeking a different kind of relief. Yes, cannabis in the Middle Ages had many lives. Let's begin with its practical its industrial side. In this era, hemp was a staple crop. People used its tough stalks to make sails, ropes, clothing, and even paper. Sailors depended on it to hold their ships together. Farmers braided it into twine. Housewives patched holes in garments with hemp thread. In some towns, growing hemp was not just encouraged, but required by local laws. Its value was simply too great to ignore. And so, entire economies leaned on the plant without even touching the question of its more intoxicating powers. But of course, people knew. They always knew. There are records, quiet, passing mentions of cannabis being used medicinally. Medieval herbal texts, often copied by monks in scriptoria, list the plant among their healing entries. They speak of seed oil for swelling, poultices for inflammation, infusions for pain relief. The tone is cautious, clinical. There are no warnings of sin, no moral panic, just plants and the things they might help. Let us open one such manuscript together. The vellum pages crackle softly. The script is cramped, but careful. And there halfway down the margin I find a note: cannabis, good for gout and for the easing of sleep. The monk who penned this may not have tasted it himself. Or perhaps he did. Perhaps, one stormy night, when the pain in his knees was too sharp to pray through, he chewed a leaf in secret and waited for the ache to soften. Outside the cloister walls, in the homes of folk healers and midwives, knowledge passed not through books, but through mouths and memory. Women keepers of herbs knew which plants to gather and when. They knew that cannabis leaves, crushed and wrapped in linen, could help with burns. That the seeds, when cooked, soothed upset bellies. In these folk traditions, the line between healing and altering one's mind was never quite clear. A tincture might lull a fevered child, or lull the mind of the weary adult who drank it too. Was that healing? Was that escape? Or were they, in that moment, the same? Not every use was medical, of course. Across Europe's borders, in Islamic lands, cannabis had long been used for spiritual and recreational purposes. In regions like Persia and Egypt, writings from the 10th and 11th centuries speak of hashisha, concentrated form of cannabis resin used by Sufi mystics and common people alike. They smoked it, they infused it into food. They sought visions, tranquility, closeness with God. And while Europe's church leaders were strict about such things, the contact between cultures was never fully blocked. Through trade routes, returning crusaders, and wandering scholars, stories travelled, substances travelled too. A jar of resin here, a curious tale there. In the East, some whispered, they use the herb to see beyond the veil. Imagine a merchant in Venice, unrolling a silk bundle before a curious nobleman. From Damascus, he says, and strong. Good for the nerves. Good for dreams. The nobleman listens, intrigued. Will he try it? Will he share it? Or simply lock it in a cabinet, unsure of its power? Back in Europe, use remained more subdued. If cannabis was consumed for its mental effects, it was often kept quiet. The Church, always suspicious of altered states not induced by prayer or penance, viewed intoxication with wary eyes. Wine, sanctified by ritual, was one thing, but a herb that soothed sorrow without confession, that was another matter entirely. Still, there were moments, glimmers. In some healing manuals, cannabis was listed as a sleep aid, a dream bringer. In the right hands, it was gentler than alcohol, more reliable than prayer, a balm for those whose minds ran too fast, whose grief bit too sharply. But can imagine, can't we, an old woman sitting by her fire, arthritis flaring in her hands. She dips her fingers into a pot of cannabis-infused oil. The heat of the hearth meets the warmth of the bomb. Her hands loosen. Her breath deepens. She doesn't speak of it to the priest. She doesn't need to. Cannabis existed, then, in a kind of shadow, not banned outright, but never quite embraced. Not celebrated, but not forgotten. In the margins of medicine, in the edges of memory, it was a peasant's remedy, a merchant's curiosity, a monk's whisper, and all the while it grew. Quietly, persistently, like the knowledge passed from mouth to ear. Too soft to write, but too strong to erase. Even the criminal records of some cities make mention of cannabis, for its consumption, but for its theft. Fields of hemp were valuable. To steal a harvest was to steal cloth, rope, medicine, and yes, possibly even a mild escape from pain. It mattered. It was protected. There is something poetic in how cannabis slipped between categories in the medieval mind. It was a tool, a cure, a curiosity, and perhaps, sometimes, a doorway. But it was never center stage, never painted into altar frescoes or saintly stories. Just quietly, persistently. There. And now, centuries later, it still grows. The plant remains much the same. But the stories around it have changed many times. Once it was sacred, then suspicious, then secret, and now, again, it is rising into view. We are about to drift into a sacred space, a quieter space. A space lit not by torches or candles, but by the flickering light of visions, prayers, and ancient faith. Tonight, we are not searching taverns or wandering marketplaces. We're not brewing potions or sniffing herbs beside an apothecary's table. No, tonight we walk barefoot through the cloisters of silence into the hidden places of the medieval spirit, where the mind opened, and perhaps something else stepped in. In the medieval world, altered states of consciousness were not only the realm of medicine or mischief, they were often divine, or dangerous, or both. Let's begin with the hush of a monastery at midnight. A young monk kneels on cold stone. His breath forms small clouds in the dark. He has fasted for days, spoken to no one, prayed for hours. And now his body is weak, but his mind is opening. He sees something, not with his eyes, but behind them. A light, a voice, a shape, a warmth. Was it God? A vision of the Virgin Mary? Or simply hunger and exhaustion playing tricks on a mind primed for wonder? In the Middle Ages, such experiences were not rare, nor were they always questioned. In fact, visions and trances were often accepted if they came to the devout, those deemed pure and holy. Many of the saints we read about today claimed to have seen angels, demons, even Christ himself. In moments of intense spiritual ecstasy, some of these altered states were induced by fasting, vigils, isolation, and chanting. Imagine repeating a single prayer over and over for hours in the echoing dark. The words lose meaning. The rhythm takes over. The self dissolves. Or it is here, just on the edge of sleep, of starvation, of surrender, that the visions often came. Strange, yes, but also sacred. Women were often at the center of these experiences. The mystic Hildegard of Bingen, for example, saw colorful, geometric visions, bright wheels of flame, swirling towers of sound and light. She claimed they were from God, and the church believed her. Her writings were preserved, her art copied, her visions became doctrine. But not all were so lucky. Marjorie Kemp, a 14th century English mystic, wept constantly in religious ecstasy. She claimed to hear Jesus speak directly to her. Some admired her piety. Others whispered madness. In a time when women's voices were rarely heard, the line between holy and heretical was thin as a needle. And what of the substances? What role did the physical world play in these spiritual highs? Well, that's where the story gets even more fascinating. Across Europe and beyond, certain herbs and roots were known to open the mind or, at least, distort it. Some monasteries grew plants like henbane, mandrake, and even belladonna for medicine, but in the right hands and the right dose, they could induce visions, dreams, and yes, even trances. These substances were often part of folk rituals carried out by wise women, midwives, and herbalists. Sometimes they were ointments, rubbed into skin. Sometimes they were smoked. Sometimes eaten in tiny, careful amounts. And while the church warned against witchcraft, the boundary was always a little porous. Let's pause for a moment and imagine one such ritual. A village on the edge of a forest, the sky heavy with stars. A woman sits by a low fire, grinding dried leaves with a stone. Her voice hums an old song. Around her, others sit quiet, waiting. The smoke rises, rich and bitter. One by one, they breathe it in, and soon the world begins to shift. Shapes dance in the shadows. Someone hears their grandmother's voice. Another feels their own body fall away. Is it magic, medicine, madness, or a bridge between this world and the next? In these moments, the divine and the earthly touched fingers, and it wasn't only the peasantry. Even within monastic orders, stories whispered of strange drinks taken before visions. Certain mushrooms, especially in colder, northern regions, were rumored to bring clarity or chaos. Historians have debated this for years. There are no smoking guns, no glowing goblets labeled vision juice. But the patterns, they're there, psychedelic spirituality, we might call it now. But in the Middle Ages, it was simply mystery. The desert hermits of early Christianity, those who wandered into the sands to be alone with God, often reported hallucinations. Some saw monsters, others angels. Hunger and heat played their part, but perhaps something more did too. Let's not forget the Dionysian echoes, the ancient festivals of wine, dance, and ecstasy. Though officially condemned, traces of these ecstatic rituals survived in folk festivals and seasonal rites. And in certain villages, the veil between pagan and Christian was paper-thin. The church tried again and again to corral these wild threads, to label holy what fit and demonize what did not. But the people kept dreaming. Even music played its part. Gregorian chant, with its haunting tones and repetitive phrases, could lead the listener into a kind of trance. Imagine sitting in a vast cathedral, the scent of incense thick, the light dim, and voices rising like smoke. You wouldn't need any herbs to feel altered. The space itself would shift you. And then there were the shamans. Yes, even in medieval Europe, echoes of shamanic practice lingered. In remote regions, across the Baltic, in the far north, in pockets of rural Ireland or Finland, certain individuals were believed to speak with spirits, to travel in dreams, to heal through trance. Their tools, drums, plants, songs, ritual silence, the line between medicine man and witch was drawn by power and fear. But their roles were clear. They mediated between this world and the unseen. Some were feared, some revered. All were, in some way, altered. Even in the Islamic world, Sufi mystics twirled themselves into ecstasy. Their dance a prayer, their breath a song. They spoke of wine, not the kind in goblets, but the wine of union with the divine. A sweet drunkenness, a holy intoxication. This language traveled through poetry, through music, through traders and texts, and so, even as the Church tightened its grip on Western Europe, the idea that one could touch the divine through ecstasy never died. It lived in psalms, in secret songs, in herbs passed hand to hand, in dreams whispered upon waking. Let your mind wander now. Picture a pilgrim resting at a shrine. She has walked for weeks, her feet are blistered, her heart heavy. She eats a simple stew made by the village healer. There's something in it bitter, earthy. She sleeps, and dreams of her dead husband smiling. When she wakes, her grief has lifted just a little. She doesn't question it. She lights a candle. She moves on. That is how it often was. No one called it getting high. There were no hashtags, no labels, just moments of expansion, of mystery, of stepping, however briefly, into the glow of something more. And isn't that what we all long for, in our own quiet way? A break from the noise, a flicker of connection, a sense that beyond our skin and sorrow there is something larger, kinder, truer. The medieval world dense with incense. Hunger, silence, and songs offered many such doors. Some were carved into chapel walls, others hidden in herb gardens. But all of them were real. We've wandered far on our journey through the medieval world, through herb gardens and shadowed monasteries, bustling taverns and ancient sickbeds. Tonight, let us settle in a quieter place. A place not of potions or plants, but of rules, of judgment, of how society looked at those who reached for altered states and how it chose to treat them. For even then, long before forensic labs and pharmaceutical labels, people had opinions, deep ones, and laws, too, about what was right, what was dangerous, what was forbidden, and what simply made someone a little suspicious. Let's begin in the center of town. Picture a village gathering. The local friar has just spoken of the dangers of indulgence, of drunkenness, gluttony, and sinful behaviors. The townsfolk nod, some perhaps guiltily. Behind the sermon is something deeper, the belief that to lose control of the body was to open the door to the devil. Intoxication, in this world, was often seen not just as a lapse in discipline, but as a spiritual threat. It wasn't just a matter of health, it was a matter of the soul. In Christian teaching, moderation was sacred. Sobriety wasn't only about avoiding drink, it was a spiritual ideal to be clear-minded, devoted, present before God. The book of Proverbs warned that wine was a mocker and strong drink a brawler. St. Paul wrote that drunkenness led to debauchery. In monastic communities, these weren't metaphors. They were guidelines for living. And yet, alcohol flowed freely in many towns. Mead was brewed, ale was shared. Monasteries even produced their own wine. The contradiction, it lay in intention. To drink was one thing, to become drunk was another. But where did society draw the line? Who decided what counted as sinful excess? That's where it gets intriguing. Let's wander into a medieval law court. In some places, especially in later medieval England and France chronic, intoxication could be punished by fines. A man who was habitually drunk might be labelled a nuisance, even a danger to the community. Repeat offenders, they might be publicly shamed, whipped, or even imprisoned for disturbing the peace. But not all substances were treated equally. Some, like herbs used in healing, were largely accepted. If a wise woman brewed poppy tea for pain, few questioned it so long as she wasn't accused of witchcraft. And there's the catch. For many substances, the danger wasn't just what they did to the body. It was the suspicion they raised. What was she putting in that potion? Why was that man always staring at the moon, mumbling to himself? What were those herbs really for? Accusations could come swiftly, especially in times of fear, disease, or poor harvest. Now imagine the same healer, once trusted, suddenly whispered about, her remedies said to induce dreams, or worse, her collection of plants seen as sinister. What protected her yesterday might condemn her today. In the early medieval period, laws were often local, passed down by custom rather than codified text. But over time, church canon law began to influence civil judgments more and more. By the 13th and 14th centuries, people began associating certain forms of altered states, especially those involving ritual or trance, with heresy. Particularly dangerous were those said to achieve ecstasy outside the bounds of sanctioned religious practice. Think of women who danced in fields during solstice rites, or men who claimed to speak with angels after drinking strange brews. The Church did not take such claims lightly, and when fear arose, so too did punishment. Inquisitors weren't just hunting theological errors, they were searching for signs of spiritual deviance. This included behaviors linked to intoxication, especially if they came with prophecy, visions, or defiance of authority. Let's not forget the gender divide. Men were more easily forgiven. A drunken knight was boisterous, a drunken woman dangerous. Women who lost composure were often seen as unfit, immoral, even possessed. Their behavior invited not just judgment, but intervention. Public penalties could be cruel: stocks, pillories, even ritual shaming parades. A woman caught selling questionable herbs might be led through town with her wares tied around her neck. A man found raving in the streets might be doused with cold water and mocked before the crowd. Of course, not everyone was treated the same. Nobles often avoided such scrutiny. Their indulgence in wine or rare imported drugs like certain opiate mixtures or exotic spices was framed as luxury, not crime. A lord sipping dream wine from Persia was sophisticated. A peasant chewing a strange root in the woods, suspicious, possibly a devil worshipper, and this double standard extended beyond punishment to medical treatment. If a nobleman suffered melancholy, he might be prescribed opium, wine, or calming herbs. If a poor man acted oddly after the same, he might be branded a madman, or worse, a heretic. Now let's peer into the records of physicians and clerics. Many kept careful notes. Some even debated the ethics of drugs that soothed pain but clouded the senses. Could one enter heaven with a drugged mind? Was suffering part of salvation? These were not idle questions. Some theologians, like Thomas Aquinas, permitted mild use of pain relievers, but warned that pleasure taken from intoxication, even if accidental, could lead to sin. So the line between medicine and misuse was always blurry. Context was everything, and suspicion never far behind. Still, even amid these tensions, medieval people sought comfort, and so underground, hidden, half-approved networks of use persisted. A little sleeping potion passed hand to hand, a secret mixture shared among midwives, a calming herb grown behind the kitchen garden. Society frowned, but society also understood. Quietly, let's not forget the power of rumor. In small villages, one accusation could change a life. A child with fever might recover after a herbal drink, and the healer praised. But if that child died, suddenly the same herbs were poison, the same healer a witch. And yet, not all tales were dark. Some communities protected their wise ones, gave them space, honored their craft. Some rulers even employed court alchemists, people who blended science, sorcery, and medicine. The irony: what might earn a villager death could earn a court magician praise. By the late Middle Ages, documents began to catalogue more specific bans. Markets had rules about what could be sold. Apothecaries were sometimes licensed. Certain herbs were restricted. Towns posted signs forbidding the sale of mad roots or sleeping vine to anyone but healers. The authorities were learning to regulate. But always, the people found ways around, because what society called vice, the sufferer might call relief. What the law called intoxication, the mystic called enlightenment. In the end, it was a dance between control and escape, between order and desire, between the visible and the hidden. The medieval world was not blind to the pull of altered states. It feared them, needed them, punished them, protected them. And so tonight, as you drift further into warmth and rest. Remember this: behind every law was a story, behind every judgment, a fear, and behind every whispered secret recipe or healing. The story begins with the earth itself. The soil was the first apothecary. Plants wild and cultivated held power, not metaphorical power, but real, visceral magic. Mandrake, henbane, poppy, cannabis, nightshade, all grew silently across the landscape, waiting for someone to ask something of them, a pain to soothe, a spirit to summon, a dream to deepen. Imagine a village healer, hands stained green from herbs, whispering charms over a bowl of crushed roots. Not because she thought herself a sorceress, but because that's how things were done. Because her grandmother had done it, and hers before her. Because, in the absence of written science, there was tradition and belief. And then, opposite her, a monk in a stone cell, eyes closed in prayer. He hasn't taken a drop of opium or tasted a leaf of hemp, and yet he trembles with visions, holy ecstasies, bright-winged angels and dark valleys of despair. Was it divine? Was it the fasting, the sleeplessness, the power of the mind spiraling inward? He didn't need a potion to reach that altered, stately silence, scripture and solitude. And so we see, in the medieval world, the idea of intoxication stretched beyond the physical. It was as much about belief as it was about chemistry. The line between body and spirit was porous. You could drink a decoction of mandrake and slip into dreams, or fall to your knees in prayer and rise again, swearing you had touched the eternal. But this blending of sacred and profane made the subject delicate. The Church, as we've discussed in hushed tones, held tight reins over the soul. Anything that might loosen them: herbal potions, ecstatic visions, even laughter that lingered. Too long invited suspicion, and yet the Church itself preserved knowledge of medicinal intoxicants. Monks copied recipes. Some priests used wine not just for mass, but for healing. It was, as always, a contradiction, a dance between fear and necessity. There was fear, deep, whispering fear. Fear that a wrongly brewed tea might call not healing, but demons. That nightshade in the wrong hands was not a cure, but a curse. That women who knew too much of herbs were not healers, but witches. And yet, the same plants were kept close, their names written into old texts, their roots hidden in satchels hung near the bed. Medieval people did not have our modern language. They didn't speak of hallucinogens or neuroreceptors. They didn't test dosages in labs or analyze brain waves. What they had were stories and symbols and faith. They trusted the old tales that said mandrake screamed when pulled from the ground, or that poppy could open the door to a gentler death. These weren't superstitions, they were survival strategies wrapped in myth. You and I live in a world of data and disclaimers. A world where medications come with printed labels and long explanations, but back then there was only the feel of a root in the hand, the color of a powder in the sun, the memory of a neighbor's pain eased by an unknown blend. It was intuitive, intimate, dangerous, and deeply human. And then there was celebration. We mustn't forget that getting high was not always about sickness or sorrow. It lived in joy too. In ale shared on festival nights, in mead sipped by firelight, in laughter that rolled through narrow streets and across castle halls, in music that grew louder as wine spilled freely. The altered state could be communion not just with the divine, but with each other. At the heart of it all, perhaps, was longing, a longing to feel more or less, to go beyond the veil of everyday toil, whether through poppy milk, incense, smoke, fasting, prayer, or fermented drink. Medieval people reached toward something else, something other. They were not fools. They knew the dangers. They knew that too much could kill, that visions could lie, that ecstasy could burn. And yet they reached anyway. Because that's what humans do. We seek, we risk, we hope. The legacy of medieval intoxicants, then, is not merely a list of plants or potions. It's a mirror, one that reflects back our eternal hunger for meaning, comfort, connection. One that shows us how thin the line has always been between medicine and magic, between ritual and recreation, between sacred and sinful. And here's the strange, beautiful truth. Those old leaves and tinctures, those whispered prayers and forbidden brews, they've left their trace in us, in the way we talk about healing, in the fears we inherit, in the remedies we reach for, and the taboos we tiptoe around. They shaped how we understand pain and peace, and even pleasure. So tonight, as your eyes grow heavy and your thoughts soften like dusk upon a field, remember this: the people of the past were not so different from us. They too lay awake, wondering how to quiet their minds. They too sought relief, revelation, and rest. And in their gardens and kitchens, their temples and taverns, they found ways, strange ways, sacred ways, sometimes dangerous ways, to feel just a little more alive. Their legacy is not lost. It lingers in stories like this one, in quiet nights like this, and perhaps, most gently, in your dreams. Now breathe in slowly. Let the flicker of candlelight fade. Let the hum of old voices soften into silence. You've walked a long way through the winding alleys of history. You've listened well. And now it's time to sleep. May the spirits of curiosity and calm walk beside you. May the old herbs whisper gently, not of danger, but of peace. And may your rest be deep, dreamless, or perhaps touched by just the faintest shimmer of forgotten magic. If this tale soothed your mind, or made the night feel a little kinder, I'd love to know, but only when you wake. For now, the stars are high, the earth is still, and the story is complete. Sweet dreams.